I've got some PHP on one slide. Are you ready for some PHP?
Yeah.
You're gonna have to wait because it's quite near the end. But as it's a lightning talk, everything's near the end, so it's all good. So I'm talking about oEmbed, which is something that you may be aware of. It's something perhaps you won't be aware of. It's one of those things that's great for a lightning talk, I always think, because once you're aware that it's there, you might not use it immediately, you might not use it ever, but it might come up in a meeting and then you can say, oh, we should use oEmbed for that, and you'll look really clever. So it's just useful to know it's there. The reason I thought about presenting on this was that our dear friend Rob here contacted me the other day about a product that I run, saying, oh, is there a way to do X? I said, yes, we support oEmbed, and Rob very reasonably said, oEmbed, what on earth's that, and how on earth would I know? So I explained it and thought I maybe ought to explain it to other people as well. So here we go. Really familiar scenario. You have websites that have bits of rich content of some sort on, so YouTube videos, photos on Flickr, presentations on Noticed, which is my product, so pay particular attention to that one. This is what is, I've got a SoundCloud with stuff from when I was in a band when I was 17. But they all have sort of rich media on them that you might want to embed elsewhere on the web. They all have these little share buttons, which doesn't really matter, you can see. The little share buttons, the user clicks those, and then they get given a chunk of HTML. That HTML is the secret to displaying a nice representation of that item of media somewhere else on the web. So they can then take that and put that into their blog post, and this is like one from Flickr, and it turns it, rather than just having the raw image, it's a nice little representation with the username and a bit of branding and the description from the image, and you know, it basically takes a URL and turns it into a rich representation of the content that's at the other end of that URL. So if you're building some sort of publishing system, maybe it's like a small content management system, basically anywhere where you're accepting content from the user, where they might put in a URL, and you want to take that URL and turn it into something nicer to display at the other end. You want to identify that this is something more than just a boring URL. There's a bit of content that I could fetch and turn into a richer representation. How on earth do you go about doing that? You basically want to get from a URL to a chunk of HTML. Now, okay, so this is Flickr. Think, well, okay, Flickr's pretty common, or it used to be. I can, create a template for this. I can maybe use the Flickr API. They have a really good API, so I could go in and I could figure out what the different bits are and build that. But then somebody wants to, embed a YouTube video. Think, well, okay, YouTube's got a good API, and you can start building out all these different implementations for all the different providers. But that doesn't really scale very well. And the bad news is that the first time anyone tries to use any of those services, they're going to have a really bad experience because it just won't work. And then they'll contact you, and then you'll have a bad experience because you have to talk to a user. So this is where oEmbed comes in. It's basically for turning URLs into embed code. That's pretty much its job. It was created by Leah Culver, Cal Henderson, Mike Malone, and Richard Crowley. Leah and Mike were building Pounce. Does anyone remember Pounce? No one remembers Pounce, and it makes me so sad. It was a competitor to Twitter back in the day, and it was much better, and nobody used it, but it was good. So Leah and Mike were making Pounce. Cal was making Flickr. And they were in San Francisco, sat around a table at lunch. They were probably having some sort of vegan thing. And they decided that this is a real problem. Cal was a provider of media in that he had Flickr. Leah was a consumer of media. She had Pounce, accepting user URLs. They thought, hey, we could figure this out between us. And so they did. So the process is this. You have a URL that's provided by the user. What you do is you fetch that URL, and it's going to take you to an HTML page. In the head of that HTML page, if the site supports oEmbed, there is a link in the head, a bit of metadata that gives you the URL of an API endpoint. You just request that API endpoint, and you get a nice JSON structure back that describes the media. So in the top of that HTML, here's what the metadata might look like. Link rel equals alternate because it's an alternate representation of the content. Type is application stroke JSON plus oEmbed. That's cool. And then the href is the URL of the API that you're going to request. So for this example, the API oEmbed is just my local, well, not local, but this site's path to its API. And then you've got two arguments that you're passing: URL equals, and then a URL encoded version of the URL, and then format equals JSON. I'll let you into a secret. oEmbed does actually support XML, but we're not animals, so we'll use JSON. So you request that API URL that you've just been given, and this is what you might get back. This is something from one of my presentations on Notice. So you've got the title, the author name. There's a whole load of different properties that optionally oEmbed providers can send you in the response. But there are some really crucial ones that are always there. Things like this one, HTML, and that gives you the HTML embed code that you can then use in your presentation of that content. Pretty genius, right? So how do we do it in PHP? Are we ready for some PHP? It's coming, not quite yet though. There are some dedicated oEmbed libraries for PHP. None of them have made it as far as packages because they're old and they're rubbish. One of them's on Google Code. So well, it's unfair to say they're rubbish. I haven't used them to know that they're rubbish. They're very, very old. The sort that you look at, you think, I'm not even going to try it. So some of those, but they're out of date, but there is a solution. There's this package on packages called oEmbed. They're very creative with the naming of that one. It's by Oscar Otero, or Otero, I'll go with. And what this does is it supports oEmbed. So you give it a URL, and it will use oEmbed to pass the page at the end of that to find out if there's support. That is, unless it happens to know about the site that you're requesting. If it recognizes the domain, so if it recognizes it's twitter.com, it's got adapters in there to deal with, particularly with Twitter. It's got Open Graph adapters. It's got adapters for loads and loads of really popular big sites. So actually somebody else has done the work of the specific implementations for those sites that don't support oEmbed. And everything else, it just tries oEmbed. And if oEmbed is there, it works. And it returns that as a nice unified, whatever API ends up using, it gives you a nice unified object in response. Here's the PHP. Yeah. And it's really complex. So you just use embed, and then you say embed create, pass it the URL that you've pulled out of the user's content, and then you can access things like title, description. There's a whole load of properties that it could possibly be. It will give you the canonical URL, which is handy. And this is the really good one for our purposes. The code property will give you the embed code that it's found out of that content. That's not all. You can become a provider if you want. I mean, you don't have to, but if you've got some content that you have on your own property that you provide embed code that other people can use, if you've got one of those share buttons that gives some HTML that people can put in their blogs or what have you, you can become an oEmbed provider. So yeah, first requirement is have some content. All you do then is just create your API endpoint that accepts a URL and a format. Generally, format's always going to be JSON. You can actually say, I'm only supporting JSON. You can be really stubborn and pig-headed about that, or reasonable. And you then return JSON or XML. And you basically just, in that response, include any information that you've got using the properties that are in the spec. So if you've got a title, give it a title. If you've got description, use that. And hopefully you will have an embed code which you can return. And then you just add a link to where that endpoint is, just as we saw, into your detail pages on your application. And that's it. I implemented it, and it was so trivially easy to do. It probably took, I don't know, about half an hour end-to-end from reading the spec to deployment. It was super, super easy. And you can find all the information about it at oembed.com, where there's a spec, which is really easy to understand. And that's pretty much it. Thank you very much.